All right, here we go. Three, two, one. Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you from Ra'anana, right outside Tel Aviv. It is the week of February 23rd, 2025. And today's episode, episode 71 of it, is called Joel Loves Chabad. And it's a follow up to the episode I did last week where I basically recapped, told you what it was like to be in the US and Canada for 12 of the last 24 months. My takeaways about the state of Judaism in North America right now. If you didn't check out that episode, if you didn't hear it, I'll give you the short version, al regel echad, as we say, on one foot. I wasn't so optimistic about the future in general of Judaism in North America. Largely because it just seems to me that most American Jewish families have decided that making Judaism a meaningful part of their life, meaning not a hobby, not something they do every once in a while, but truly a meaningful part of their lives in such a way that it would actually get passed down to the next generation. I talked a lot about Jewish continuity and why that matters, that I didn't really see that happening for the most part. And the follow up to that is that I actually do think that a lot of the future of Judaism in North America and maybe even around the world outside of Israel lies with Chabad and the Chabad type of model. And today I'm going to talk about what they're doing and what I really love about Chabad. I'm going to talk from my own experience and I'll explain exactly what that means. And I did back up last week's sentiment that I was feeling with actual statistics, meaning that demographers predict that by the year 2100, 80% of the world's Jews are going to live in Israel. About 20 million Jews living in Israel, and another 4 million living throughout the world, scattered in the US, Canada, Europe, Australia, various other places. But for the most part, Judaism will be concentrated in Israel. And a big reason for that is not just the pull of Israel itself, but that the movements other than the Orthodox in the US are shrinking. And although they might be strong in what they're doing now, today, they're not really laying the groundwork for the type of Jewish continuity it would take to have thriving Jewish communities in North America 40 years from now. We'll get to that about why I love Chabad. But first, I do want to talk about a couple of related news stories this week. First, I'm not even sure what the right adjective is. Horrifying, deplorable, the horrible story about the Bibas family. Last Thursday, as part of the hostage deal, we had a number of the bodies of deceased hostages released. According to the terms of the deal, Israel was going to release close to 50 Palestinian terrorists jailed in exchange just for bodies, the dead bodies of Israeli hostages being held in Gaza. And among them were the three members of the Bibas family who've been unaccounted for. Shiri Bibas, who I believe was 32, and her two boys, Ariel and Kfir, the redheads, the Jinjim, as they're known here in Israel, who really became a symbol for October 7th and the horrors of it. I mean, kidnapping children, it really doesn't get worse than that. And they had these cute, adorable faces that everyone could relate to, and they were reminders to all of us of why we were fighting, why we were in Gaza, what was at stake, and what had happened on October 7th. And it had been feared for a while that Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir were not accounted for and that they were dead. But we got confirmation last week. Hamas said that their three bodies would be three of the bodies that were released. I don't know if you know the inside story, but there was quite a media circus here in Israel because Netanyahu, the prime minister, went on the air and talked about how sad and awful it was that the Bibas trio, Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir, had been killed, and that they were not coming back to Israel. And then the Bibas family, including Yardain, the father who was released a few weeks ago alive, he'd been held hostage in Gaza. The Bibas family said that they did not give permission to the government to announce that the Bibas family, Yarden, sorry, that the Bibas family, Shiri, Kfir, and Ariel, were actually coming out. They didn't give permission to the government to announce that because they wanted proof. They wanted the bodies to actually be checked forensically and to verify that it was, in fact, the bodies of those three. And I must say, most of the Israeli public, we kind of shook our heads, but we all kind of said, "Well, we know it's them. We know they've been killed. What's with this now of waiting for actual proof?" But lo and behold, when they checked the bodies, yes, Ariel and Kfir, their bodies matched up, but the woman who was released was not Shiri Bibas. It was the body of a Gazan woman. And Hamas claimed later that it had made some sort of mistake when it was pulling bodies out of the rubble. It was too difficult to identify which body was which. But from what I've heard, this was a no-brainer. This was not the type of thing where forensics was actually needed. It was clear that it was not Shiri Bibas. And Hamas simply gave us, I won't even say the wrong body because that would imply it was a mistake. Hamas gave Israel a different body other than Shiri Bibas. And so that led to a whole new stage of outrage here in Israel at just how horrific Hamas is. And then within 48 hours, the body of Shiri Bibas, the correct one, was released to Israel and brought into Israel. I think it was around 2 in the morning. And just to show you what Israelis are like, one of the things I've tried to do on this podcast is to introduce you to Israeliness and what I really feel is special about the Israeli people and why it is worth living here despite how hard it is, despite fighting 2, maybe 3 wars at the same time, despite what happened on October 7th, despite the fact that we came close to having a huge terrorist attack on Friday morning, which I'll get to. Is one of the reasons, maybe the only reason, is just how special the Israeli people are, that makes it all worthwhile, or at least more tolerable. And the other night, when Shiri Bibas's body was brought back to Israel at 2 o'clock in the morning, Israelis lined the streets. As her body was brought to, I believe it's called Abu Kabir or Abu Kfir, uh, the body identification center in Israel. As her body was brought back, Israelis lined the streets with flags. Soldiers were out saluting. Even though it was 2 o'clock in the morning, people were paying their respects to Shiri. And that's what Israelis are like. And that's why I'm here now. I told you we almost had a terrorist attack Friday morning. There are those who said, wow, God truly loves us that this attack didn't actually happen. To which the counter was, well, if God truly loved us, how do you explain October 7th? But here's what went down. Around 10 o'clock at night, Thursday night, 3 buses exploded in the Cholon Bat Yam area. And once these exploded, police started looking and they found another number of explosives on buses, in trains that had not gone off yet. These explosives, these bombs were planted by uh, a Palestinian from, we believe, from Tulkarem uh, in over the in the Shtachim in the West Bank. How he got into Israel, we still do not know. That's being investigated. But his intention was that these bombs, all of them, would go off between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock in the morning on Friday morning. Friday morning is when the buses are packed with soldiers coming home from the weekend, with people going to their Shabbat destinations all over the country, probably the busiest day of the week, along with Sunday morning, Friday morning, and Sunday morning. And the intention was that these buses and the other explosives would all blow up between 10 and 11 a.m. Friday morning when all these travelers were on board. By an accident that we can only call a miracle, the terrorist set these bombs to explode not at 10 a.m., but he set the timer to go off at 10 p.m. And so inadvertently, without realizing he'd done that, he blew up three empty buses at 10 o'clock at night, as opposed to three full buses or other and more at between 10 and 11 Friday morning. So it was really just this accident of setting the timer to PM rather than AM that saved hundreds, literally hundreds of lives. I mean, if 50 people had been on each of those buses, that's 150 people right there. Given the size of the blast, there's really no way of believing that anyone would have survived. Then you add on the other explosives on the buses and trains, you add on the passerby. It's a miracle this didn't happen. But that's what we are living with here. And along with that, we live with the release of six more hostages a few days ago on Shabbat, in another round of this emotional roller coaster. People crying, people laughing, the the surge of emotions as we see our fellow civilians being released from Gaza, going through these horrific ceremonies in Gaza where they're forced to wave to the crowd and kiss their Hamas captors on the forehead. That's what Omer Shem Tov was forced to do. They all looked okay when they were released. They were walking upright, but they all claimed, and they all explained, I should say, after getting back to Israel, that they had lost probably between 30 and 50 pounds each. But in the time leading up to their release, Hamas started feeding them again so that they would look healthy when they were released and look like they had been taken care of. And every hostage released so far has said that they were basically skeletal when they were being held hostage in Gaza, but that they were fattened up and fed uh, in the time leading up to their release. But that's what we've been up to here in Israel. And I wanted to touch on those news stories because they really were important. And now on to today's main topic. Joel loves Chabad. And I'm talking to you about Chabad from two perspectives. First, as a comedian who's performed at many, many a Chabad house around, not just around the US or even North America, but around the world. I've done shows at the Chabad house in Zurich, Switzerland for a bar mitzvah, and in Cusco, Peru for Sukkot for the Israelis who were there, and several dozen across North America and Canada. But I also speak to you as someone who's frequented Chabad as a world traveler. As you may know, in 2015, before moving to Israel, my family and I left the New York City area and we traveled around the world for 1 year. We backpacked through South America, Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, Australia, Japan. And we found Chabad at every step along the way. Whether it was to celebrate Yom Kippur at the Chabad in La Paz, Bolivia, or to do Sukkot in Cusco, Peru, with the wonderful Chabad family that Dorit is still in touch with. I remember doing Hanukkah in Johannesburg, South Africa, with that Chabad. Everywhere we went, they were there for us. And so I really have seen Chabad up close, both as a performer who's worked with them and as a guest who's, would you say, taken advantage of them or reached out to them for the Judaism we needed along the way as we have traveled. And I'm continually impressed by what Chabad does. And rather than just give you some sort of global picture of it, I wanted to break it down into exactly what impresses me so much and what I think that Chabad is doing right. And this is in no particular order, but they're all, I think, equally important. So, number one, they do not judge. And I mean that. There really is no judgment with Chabad. When you send your kid to nursery school at Chabad, which we did in Greenwich, Connecticut, they try to give your kid the best Jewish education they can, but they never pull you aside and ask you if you are keeping kosher or if you are Shomer Shabbat or would you like to consider being more religious. Now, a lot of times, the parents at the Chabad nursery school I was at actually end up to becoming more religious because they're touched by what their kids are learning. And so they start inquiring and asking questions and become a little more involved themselves. But it isn't pushed on you. You never get the idea that there's an end game, that there's some sort of end goal that this is all leading up to because of ulterior motives. There really is no judgment. And if you want to drive to Shabbat services Friday night, and then afterwards get in your car and drive to a restaurant and a movie with your family, they are not going to try to talk you out of it. They are just genuinely glad that you are there for that Shabbat service Friday night, and they are going to make that the best Friday night service you can possibly have. So I'm really impressed by the lack of judgment in their decision not to be judgy and not to try to convert. Number two, there are no dues. One of the big problems with the traditional synagogue model in the United States is that the dues are exorbitant. You're talking $3,000 plus in some of these big suburban synagogues. And I remember I was sending three of my kids to Jewish day school at the time. And I still had to make the case for why my dues should maybe be a little bit lower. Here were families who were not sending kids to day school who were paying the exact same dues rate that I was. And I actually remember saying to the either the rabbi or the administrator, like, you should have a different dues schedule for people who send their kids to summer camp and send their kids to Jewish day school because we're already pouring a lot of money into this system. It should be a little more equal and equitable. And I don't think that's happened. But one of the big problems is the dues they're really out of hand to the point where people are really questioning, well, what am I getting for $3,000 a year? And people will do it. They'll pay for that year or two before their child's bar mitzvah so that he or she can get the requisite number of number of appearances in synagogue to qualify for the bar bat mitzvah. But over a 10-year period, 13-year period, you're looking at thirty to $40,000 a year total. $30 to $40,000, which is a huge amount for a family if they're on the fence about how Jewish they want to be. So Chabad does not have dues for the most part. Chabad is really just based on contributions and fundraisers, but even there, it's a different model. I would say that most Jewish organizations, their philosophy, from what I observe, is let's raise the money, and then with the money we raise, we will do great programming or great charity work or whatever it is. In Chabad, it's the opposite. It's let's give people good programming. Let's give people meaningful Judaism, and then the money will follow. It's much more of a philosophy based on abundance than a philosophy based on lack. And I do think it works. I think when people go to Chabad regularly, they are genuinely moved by what they experience, whether it's services or holiday celebrations or even the one on one availability that Chabad offers to people, again, with no judgment. And so people end up giving willingly as opposed to feeling like they're being coerced or that they have to. So that model of give them something good and the money will follow, I think is a good one. And I wish more Jewish organizations would subscribe to it. The third really big point I see is what I would call meaningful Judaism. When Chabad does a program or has a holiday celebration, it has real, meaningful Judaism incorporated into it. They never lose that. They never drop that. And what I sometimes see with other organizations is that programming can be watered down as a way to make the tent bigger, as a way to get people in the door. But it can be so watered down where you don't even realize that it's Jewish or that it stands with Israel or has a connection to deeper Judaism. But with Chabad, they always make sure that the meaningful Judaism is there. And look, we're living in an age when people want meaning. More and more people, at least those who would consider attending synagogues, people have what they need and they have a lot of what they want. And they have children in good colleges and nice homes and can take the vacations they want. So, what they're really after, though, is meaning. Because more and more in this chaotic world of ours, we're searching for meaning. We're searching for connection. We're looking to make sense of everything happening around us. And I think Chabad knows that people want meaningful Judaism. And I sometimes get the sense that other movements and other Jewish organizations are afraid that if it's too Jewish, people won't come in the door, that we don't want to scare them with the Judaism. And Chabad has never been afraid of scaring people with the Judaism. They've just given them meaningful Judaism and people continue to show up. I think people want it and they're not afraid to deliver it. Now, look, on college campuses, we got to acknowledge that a lot of what Chabad has done, part of their model, is give alcohol as well. And I'm not in favor of that. But I think on the college campus, too, Hillel has become largely a place for Jewish activity and Jewish bonding, and maybe Israel, a safe haven from Israel criticism. But the real Judaism is not in Hillel, unless you have a core group of Orthodox Jewish students who sort of make it happen on their own. But Chabad, meanwhile, really is still giving the Judaism on the college campus and elsewhere. And I think people want that. I think people feel lost, not maybe completely, but in some ways in today's world. And Chabad knows that giving people the Judaism they need will get them in the door and will lead to the fundraising they need. So that's why I love Chabad. And I'll tell you what I foresee. I actually foresee that the Chabad model is going to grow and that we're going to see more and more Chabads opening up in North America as some of these larger reform and conservative synagogues close. You know, when you look at just the physical footprint that so many of the reform and conservative synagogues have, I mean, huge. And they used to be able to fill them. I'm not knocking them. In the older days, these huge buildings served a purpose. I remember when I went to high holiday services at B'nai Emunah in Skokie, Illinois, sometimes we would go to the synagogue, but other years we went to Niles North High School and we sat in the auditorium at what's called the parallel service. And in these parallel services, you had another 1,000 people in addition to the 2,000 that would be at the main service at the synagogue itself. B'nai Emunah doesn't even exist anymore. That synagogue closed and it's now an Assyrian center. And that's indicative a little bit of what's happening in Skokie, Illinois compared to the other suburbs, a different story. But this idea that we need a big footprint like in the old days, well, we don't. Chabad, meanwhile, is often just a storefront or something that takes up very little space. If they can fundraise, they might build their own house, but it's a tiny house. And so that's the model I think is going to work. I think people want the intimacy. I think they want to be able to sit down with their rabbi and the rabbi's wife and whoever else is on staff and get real attention, not feel like they're only there to pay dues. And they want the meaningful Judaism, but in an intimate setting. And so I see more Chabads opening and that model in general flourishing as some of these larger institutions close simply because they don't have the membership and they can't afford to exist anymore. We had a number of questions coming in this week. I'm going to do two of them. That's traditionally what I do. This first question, it's actually a combination that a lot of you wrote in to ask. It was on the heels of last week's episode. People wrote in asking, where can I contribute? Where should I give my money? Given what I told them last week about the cost of day school being so high in particular, and how I wish the money that's being spent on birthright had instead gone to Jewish day school, people wrote in to ask, where should I give my money? Should I contribute to day school scholarship funds? Is that the best place to give? And I don't think that is the best place to give. And I'll tell you why. I think of the lot, as expensive as day school is, and as expensive as summer camp is, I do believe that if people really wanted to go there, they would find a way. I don't know there are many families who really, really very badly want to go to Jewish day school and or summer camp, but ultimately cannot because of the cost. I think scholarships are available. I also think that it's a matter of choices in their own lives that they make. I remember my dear friend and mentor, Rabbi David Soloff, when I was on staff at Camp Ramah. He told me that he couldn't even count the number of meetings he had with parents who said that they needed financial aid if they were going to send their kids to camp and then got in their Cadillac and drove away. And I'm not knocking anyone who has a Cadillac. That's not the point of the story. The point is that it comes down to making choices. And that if families really wanted to send their kids to day school or summer camp, it might be it might mean that you have a car that's a level down than the one you have now, or even live in a smaller house than you do right now, or other aspects of your lifestyle should change. Which is not to say that it's not wildly expensive. It is, it's out of control. But I have a feeling that if you were to contribute money to Jewish day school, you could be helping families who simply don't want to make a cut somewhere else in their own life, but now would be glad to take your money and help fund their Jewish day school tuition. That's a wild judgment call on my part. I realize how judgy that sounds saying that as it leaves my mouth, but I actually do believe it. And so I'm not necessarily sure that donating to the scholarship funds at day schools and the camps is the best way, unless you could make sure it were reserved truly for families who needed that financial help and had already made every choice they could, every cut they could on their own before turning to the Jewish community for that help. Second question. This one came from Marla. She said, Joel, I just listened to your episode where you mentioned the New York Times ad put out by rabbis. Yes, I talked about this last week, that a number of prominent rabbis and Jewish celebrities in the US took out a full page ad in the New York Times. That's $150,000, saying that they were against the idea of ethnic cleansing and displacing the people of Gaza. And I found that deplorable. I was very adamant and outspoken about how gross I found that idea, that these rabbis whose mission should be standing up for the Jewish people and standing with Israel, that they felt the best use of $150,000 was to take out an ad in the New York Times. Um, and I explained that many of them have careers and brands that depend on speaking fees and selling books and just having their names being famous for being famous, and that an ad in the New York Times is a great way to get their brand out there and stay on brand. And it's so easy to do that when they don't have skin in the game, when they themselves are not living in Israel, when they do not have kids who are serving in the army in Israel. It's so easy to criticize from their homes in New York, LA, wherever they may be. And we saw it all the more so this week. This idea of all these innocent Gazans being displaced. Well, when you saw the hostages released a couple days ago, what we saw actually was the day the coffins were released. I believe it was on Thursday, which when this airs a week ago. That Hamas had set up a number of weapons for children and families to come, and they could hold the weapons and try on Hamas headbands and Hamas outfits and vests to dress up like a suicide bomber. It was a family fun day in Gaza, and these are the supposedly innocent Gazans that these rabbis in the New York Times are standing up for. Future haters of Israel, future murderers of Jews. And I'm not saying the situation is perfect, and I'm also not saying that we should force all Gazans out of Gaza. It's a really complicated question. Part of it relates to just how long realistically it will take to rebuild Gaza. Probably 15 years minimum. But I do find it inexcusable that rabbis would think that the best use of their time, their brain power, and their money, and other people's money, is to take out an ad in the New York Times for $150,000. And so Marla wrote in, I just heard that episode. Why can't you, Joel, write an incredibly detailed op-ed, basically a transcript of that last podcast on the subject? And why can't we embarrass these rabbis back by starting a chip-in campaign and take the same size ad out and respond to that with our own words? Because I would be the first to put my money where my mouth is. Wow, I love that, Martha. And on the one hand, it's a great idea. We should get together and pool our money and take out a full page ad right back at those rabbis and prominent Jewish celebrities who want their names out there. Would the New York Times run our ad? I don't know, because that's not necessarily on brand with who the Times is. But I also have to wonder, like, if we did a chip-in campaign and raised 150 grand, would spending it on an ad in the Times be the best thing? And certainly from a revenge point of view, it would be. It would be great to get back at them and show them that we can play this game too. But there's so many amazing nonprofits here in Israel who could use that money, and I would rather it go there. And I'm sure deep down, Marla, you would too, and so would everyone else. But the point is, I think Marla speaks for a lot of us that we're really frustrated with our leadership. And we feel that not all, but some of our leadership is truly letting us down. And that's another reason why Chabad, I think, is on the up. And why, if Judaism were a basket of stocks, I would short Reform and Conservative, ticker symbols RFM and USCJ, I guess, or URJ and USCJ, and I would go long on CHBD, Chabad, because I really see that in addition to everything else they do, where Chabad stands where it comes to Israel. And more American Jews who are committed want that unequivocal and valid support of Israel, not the waffling that we see sometimes with the other movements. Next week's episode will be broadcast live on, oh my gosh, it's almost March. March 2nd, 2025, most likely once again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, just like this one. If you have a question or if you want to support the podcast financially, you can do both of those at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. Keep your questions, your comments, your feedback coming in. If you know people who would enjoy this podcast who currently are not subscribed to the newsletter, please send them on over to joelchasnoff.com. They can sign up for the weekly newsletter. That is where I give out the links to this pod and also insights on Hebrew words. That is called Hebrew is Magic. I truly thank all of you for joining this week. The recording will be up on the website tomorrow. That's Monday. And if you're listening to this on Apple or on Spotify, it's already up. And all episodes are broadcast as well on Apple and on Spotify. Those drop on Wednesday mornings. Just search for Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff in your podcast player. I'm Joel, signing off from Ra'anana, Israel, outside of Tel Aviv. Here is to a safe and a peaceful and a quiet week. for all of us in all of Israel. Thanks for joining the Hitraot.